Everybody, it's Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast, and we're on our third day, three days just talking about why Nehemiah in Nehemiah chapter 5 is so mad when he finds out about the economic malpractice, the exploitative behavior that is going on between some of the rich fancies among the returning Jewish exiles who are trying to rebuild the wall and reestablish their people group throughout the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. There's a bunch of these fancies who were exploiting a bunch of the normal people who got their sleeves rolled up and they're busting their butts with their businesses closed, trying to rebuild this wall while there's a famine going on, and while a whole bunch of other people who hang out with this guy named Sanballat are trying to kill them. They're kind of under a lot of pressure right now. It seems like a time where the milk of human kindness would come out and everybody would be like, we got to pull together and believe, and we got to link arms, and this is not a time for old squabbles, bickering. We got to be unified in purpose. And it was mostly, but a few of these people were turds. Their turdiness was too much for Nehemiah, and he is real mad about that. In Nehemiah 5, it says, when I, that's Nehemiah, heard the outcry or their outcry of the people who had been wronged and these charges, I was very angry. I pondered them in my mind and then accused the nobles and officials, the fancies. I told them, you're exacting usury from your own countrymen. We haven't quite got to what Nehemiah does about it yet, because before we go and look at how Nehemiah responds, I thought it'd be worth our time to try to understand why Nehemiah is so angry, because collecting interest, that's what usury means, doesn't seem like it's that big a deal. It's something everybody does. But as we're seeing over the last couple of days, that was strictly forbidden in the Old Testament. And Nehemiah is really good at Bible. He knows his stuff. And of all times to get that wrong, for the fancies to get that wrong right now, in this pivotal moment in history that we're looking at in the 440s BC in the book of Nehemiah, it's just mind-boggling to him. So we looked at Exodus 25, where it is smoking gun. You got language there that says, don't charge interest to your brothers and sisters. Just don't do that. It's economic injustice. God commands you not to. And then we spent a bunch of time yesterday in Leviticus chapter 25 looking at an even more explicit set of instructions saying you're not going to exploit the poor at all. Don't do it. Stand back to back as a people group. Don't collect interest. Don't try to profit off of the poor over food. If you got to give them food, just give them food. Don't make your Jewish brothers and sisters into slaves. You just cannot be doing that crap. The crap part was mine. God didn't say crap in the Bible. Wait, let me check. You can't. Slaves, don't be doing that. Nope, he did not. That was definitely a paraphrase. That was definitely me. But there was a hint yesterday in Leviticus chapter 25 about there being some kind of out clause with all of this. It says in Leviticus 25 verse 40, it says, he is to be treated as a hired worker or a temporary resident among you. He is to work for you until the year of Jubilee. Y and J in that are capitalized. That sounds like a real official thing. And it seems like what we're hinting at there is that it's some sort of out clause for all of the economic trappings. And so we got to get there today. But first, I want to talk about something that came up yesterday and a word that I just read right there in that verse as well. And that is slavery. I've been talking about how the Bible, even the deep Old Testament, is a very forward-looking book that is very justice-oriented. And maybe, quite reasonably, some of you are listening to this and you're like, okay, but when you say that, the people who are really into this and are like, I think there's a God and I believe in this and I go to church, they're all going to be like, they're the home team. They're going to be like, yeah, the Bible is very justice-oriented. But maybe there's some of you who are like, I'm not the home team. I don't know what I make of all of this. And thank you for being here and hanging out with me, by the way. That is awesome of you. And you look at that and you go, okay, I do hear some justice language in the Old Testament, but dude, it has the word slavery in it, and it isn't saying end all slavery. That doesn't seem very justice-y. And I agree. I don't think slavery is just. I don't think slavery is ideal. But when you line the Bible up against other ancient documents, again, this stands out as being very unusual in its consideration and valuation of slaves as people. Now, the reality is that all ancient groups, all semi-ancient groups, all classical groups, like pretty much everybody until very recently, was into slavery. There are varying degrees of horribleness when it comes to slavery over the years, ranging from, I think that's just what we call a job now, all the way down to chattel slavery in the American South, which was often wildly abusive, dehumanizing, and as bad as the practice gets. But there's a wide variety here, and different social circumstances are going to cause that to play a different role. I know it's very controversial for me to say that being a slave at certain times in the ancient world and in certain cultures was a far more desirable status than being free and thrown to the wolves. Remember, in ancient Persia, what is the currency? It is grain and it is wine. So if you're getting paid in that and paid generously in a way where your needs are met, but you can't really ever stockpile any of it or have ownership beyond your needs as a slave, that isn't that different than somebody on the low end of the socioeconomic scale who just by necessity is unable to really ever accumulate grain and wine or any kind of lasting wealth for their family. There may be people who would prefer the status in the Persian Empire of being a slave of a great house who is treated very well and enjoying all the comforts that go with that versus somebody who doesn't have the title slave but also has no foreseeable prospects. This is very hard for us to conceive of because we all went to school. We all got the very needed teaching on what life was like for slaves in the American South and the horrors of the Atlantic slave trade. But it's just not one flat thing. That word doesn't describe all of the same stuff through all of history. The economic systems and the models and just how stuff worked was very, very different in different places and at different times. I am not pro-slavery, just to be real clear. I'm against it. But also I understand that at certain points in history and in certain locations, it played a very different role and had very different connotations than it does now. So I'm sitting here saying, oh, this is a very justice-oriented document. But then we turn the page on Leviticus 25 and we get past all of the justice-y stuff about, nobody should be a slave to anybody else. In Israel, you got to, hang together with your brothers and sisters. But then there's stuff about, but sometimes foreigners might get enslaved. And you might buy a slave in this way or that way. But even with all of that said, the last chunk of Leviticus 25 talks about ways out for someone who has intentionally sold themselves into slavery because they didn't have other options. They cut off their own catalytic converter, so to speak. Or for someone who ended up there by fluke circumstances, there is this out policy. There's an off-ramp for that where everybody is compensated and justice and provision is accounted for in the state of development that the world was in the Iron Age or in the Bronze Age during the time of Leviticus. If we just look at the buzzwords like slavery, it's really easy to look at the Old Testament and just be outraged. It doesn't say stop it in all circumstances. But if we think about what the world was like and how economics were and the few options that existed for anybody to be meaningfully provided for, and we look more carefully at all of the language and ethics of how a household is to be run and how people are to be treated, it does not read like a document from 3,500 years ago. It reads like something that has the sensibilities and the concerns that sound more like things we would be worried about in terms of how people ought to be treated now. Man, this is just intense subject matter. It's more than I anticipated by so much, but I want us to get to a place where we feel the outrage at the people who are violating the written letter of the law and the spirit of the law by the way they're treating their brothers and sisters here in Nehemiah chapter 5. I want to get to a place where we understand that with a degree of the intensity that Nehemiah would feel it. This is an absolute abomination. It's an outrage. It's a violation of everything that is the point. And Nehemiah is being very restrained and saying, I was very angry. He's furious at this point. And I think the better we understand the Old Testament teaching on this material that was informing Nehemiah's ideas, the better we'll understand and feel some of that outrage as well. So guess what? We're going to take another day on it, and then that'll be it. All right, picking up where we left off next time around. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.